In this, there is the example of Hajar alayhi salam. Ibrahim alayhi salam married her after Asya alayhi salam, after Sarah alayhi salam gave her as a gift to her husband Ibrahim alayhi salam to marry, when he couldn't have any children. And Allah gave him a child from this woman. She was a servant of Sarah and she gifted her to him because she was very old. And Hajar alayhi salam was young. And Allah gifted him a child from her by the name of Ismail alayhi salam, another prophet. He was his only child. And Ibrahim alayhi salam was over 80 years old. And he was actually very old. He looked old and he was old. And Allah gave him that child after he had longed for him. And he was a boy. And Allah made him a prophet. And then suddenly one day, Ibrahim alayhi salam receives a command that he has to take his wife Hajar and his only newborn son Ismail alayhi salam into the middle of a desert, which we now know is Mecca. At those days there was nothing there. There was no water, no people, nothing. You know the story. To leave them in the middle of the desert and to return without them. Just like that. No sources, no people, no food. Leave them there and come back. And so he went on that journey. Note, Hajar alayhi salam knew nothing about it. All she knew was that they were going on a journey and they're going to come back home. But also note, my dear sisters, how she was obedient and loyal to her husband. Trust between the husband and the wife. He is a prophet of God. And she is obeying him, putting her trust and loyalty in Allah, then her husband. So they went. And when they reached the middle of the desert, they sat down, and Ibrahim alayhi salam stood up and he started to walk back to Palestine. And he did not ask his wife to follow. So she chased after him. Ya Ibrahim, ila man tatrukana? Who are you leaving us to? There's no one with us. What are you doing? And Ibrahim alayhi salam would not reply to her. Why? Because if he replies, we'll get into a conversation. And he is afraid that his heart may lose itself. He has to fulfill the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has a plan. He just kept walking straight without looking at her. And she kept on following him. Ya Ibrahim, ila man tatrukana? Who are you leaving us to? And he would not reply. He just kept walking. Finally, Hajar alayhi salam stopped for a minute and thought. With her piety, with her righteousness, with her knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, she asked one simple question. Ya Ibrahim, Allahu amaraka bihada? Is it Allah who commanded you to do this? And Ibrahim alayhi salam, still without looking at her, he replied in only one answer. He said, Naam, yes. And he kept walking. At this point, Hajar alayhi salam stopped. And she watched her husband walk away. She calmed down and she said the following words. إِذَنْ لَنْ يُضَيِّعَنَ اللَّهِ. Therefore, Allah will not let us go. Allah will not lose us. Allahu Akbar. I want you to put yourself in that position. To us it's an imagination, it's just a story. But imagine you were really there and it is you, the woman who her husband is commanded to leave her right there, in the middle of nowhere. In the middle of nowhere. There are obviously many men who can't even do what Hajar alayhi salam did. Which man can do that? We are talking about women. Which man can do that? She had the power of 100 men at that time, at heart. She said, إِذَنْ لَن يُضَيِّعَنَ اللَّهِ. Allah will not lose us. Such reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why would she not be one of those of paradise? This is a perfect example of it. إِذَنْ لَن يُضَيِّعَنَ اللَّهِ. Allah will not lose us. And you know the story. She began to run between Safa and Marwa when the food ran out, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them water called Ma' Zamzam. And a whole village came and lived around them. And Ismail alayhi salam grew, and Hajar alayhi salam lived among these people. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed it for them not only to be looked after, but to also grow a whole city, a new tribe, which never existed before. And it lasted out of her honor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored her in the Quran and honored her till today. Millions of Muslims around the world go, men and women to carry out the ritual of a woman. One woman. What do? We actually hurry between Safa and Marwa. What is it? It's walking and hurrying between Safa and Marwa. Why? Just because of one woman. Now who would you want to be honored by? The fashion industry? The media? Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Oh men, who do you want to be honored by? Your business at work? Be promoted a little bit? Okay, be promoted. But which one do you yearn for mostly? Compare. Is there any comparison between being honored by a human, by a man, or being honored by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? There is absolutely no comparison. And here is Hajar alayhi salam, one of the best examples, not only for the women, but for the men before the women.
After the true Salahuddin went back to Damascus, and the narration mentioned that one wet day he went to visit the Hajis, and when he came back it was cold, it's wet. He became ill, and every day his state got worse. And Al-Imad mentioned, I was with Salahuddin when he was ill. He says, by Allah, every time Salahuddin became more ill, it was as though his trust in the Rahmah of Allah just increased. He said the weaker his body got, the stronger his trust in Allah became. And even in that state, Salahuddin couldn't go to the masjid anymore. But he insisted on praying Salah with Jama'ah, and they would bring an Imam, they would help him up, and he would pray Salah in Jama'ah. On the 9th day, Salahuddin became unconscious. And Sheikh Jafar mentions that I was reciting the Quran by his bed, and when I reached the verses, Wallahu la ilaha illahu, alimul ghaybi wa shahada. He is Allah and no Lord besides Him, the knower of the unseen. He says Salahuddin had been unconscious for a while, and I heard a faint voice saying, Sahih, you have spoken the truth. And he mentioned, for 3 days I recited the Quran by the bed of Salahuddin. And he said, on the final day when he passed away, I reached the verse, La ilaha illahu alayhi tawakkaltu. There is no God but Allah, and upon Him I trust. And I saw Salahuddin's face become radiant, and he recited the Shahada, and he left this dunya. And Ibn Shaddad mentioned that this was the greatest calamity to befall the Muslims since the demise of the Khulafai Rashidun. Ibn Shaddad mentions that many times I had heard the saying that I wish I could die on this place. And I always thought that this was an exaggeration. But he said, I realized the reality of that statement when Salahuddin passed away. He said, I wish I could have died on the place of Salahuddin. And Abdul Latif, the famous physician, says that he was mourned like a prophet because everybody loved him. The good loved him, the bad loved him, the Muslims loved him, the non-Muslims loved him. Everybody loved Salahuddin. And what did this king leave behind him? King of Egypt, king of Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. What did he leave behind him? He left 1 dinar and 47 dirhams, some armor and a horse. This is all he left behind him. They had to borrow money for his janazah. But I'll tell you what he left behind him. He left a legacy behind him. He left a legacy behind him. And this is why we are gathered here today. He passed away at the time of Fajr, and after Dhuhr they brought his body out. And the narrations mention that people screamed and cried as though the whole dunya had just become one place. And many people, when they saw his dead body, they couldn't believe it. They became unconscious. They didn't attend the janazah because they couldn't believe that Salahuddin had passed away, the liberator of the Holy Lands. And how was Salahuddin buried? They had to borrow money for a janazah. And Qadi Fadil gave a fatwa that Salahuddin should be buried with his sword, so that on the day of judgment when he's resurrected, and one of the 7 people who is under the shade of Allah is Imamun Adilun, a just ruler, when he's under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is leaning upon his sword. So everybody sees that this is the liberator of the Holy Lands. And on his tomb they wrote, because this was the man who liberated, this was the man who flung open the gates of fortresses and castles of the Christians, one after the other. And on his tomb they wrote, "Oh Allah, as his final victory, open for him the gates of Jannah. Open for him the gates of Jannah." And my dear respected brothers and sisters listening at home, Salahuddin is one of the greatest heroes of Islam. And this is why we have gathered here to remember this. But the problem with many Muslims has become today, or with all Muslims, is that we live off our legacy. As a poet says, he said the Muslims come to the grave of Salahuddin, and they come again and again. And what do? They stand by the grave of Salahuddin and they say, "Qum ya Salahuddin, qum." "Oh Salahuddin, stand. Stand up, oh Salahuddin, we need you. Can't you see what's happening in Iraq? Can't you see what's happening in Afghanistan? Can't you see the supine, spineless leaders that we have? Oh Salahuddin, we need you to liberate the Holy Lands." The poet says they come and they say, "Qum ya Salahuddin, qum, hatta ishtaka marqaduhu min hawlihi al-afuna." He says, they come to his grave and they say, "Oh Salahuddin, stand." Until his grave began to complain about the stench around it. And the poet says, "Kam mar'atan fil ami tuqidunahu, kam mar'atan ala al-jidar al-jubni tajlidunahu, ayatlubu al-ahya'u min amwatihim ma'una." He said, how many times in the year are you going to wake Salahuddin up? He said, how many times are you going to whip Salahuddin for your own cowardice? And then he says sarcastically, ayatlubu al-ahya'u min amwatihim ma'una. He said, has it come to the state that the living have started asking the dead for help? The living have started asking the dead for help. Nobody aspires to be a Salahuddin. Nobody tries to be a Umar ibn Khattab or Abu Dhar or Abu Bakr radiallahu anhum or a Khadija or a Fatima. Nobody aspires to be like them. We live off our legacy. We remember these people, but none of us aspire to be like them. We can't be cowardice because we believe in a hereafter. You can't celebrate the life of Salahuddin and Umar ibn Khattab and then be cowardice yourself.